said we would start at 4, and I always try to do it on time that way. The reason we're in here is because we're going to try to record this and be able to make it available as we go forward as well. And since we have the cameras all automatically mounted and everything like that, it's good. The microphones here are not to pick you up in amplifying as much as to pick you up for the recording. So if there are questions or comments, that kind of stuff.
So I don't have to be here, I can go home and watch it.
You would miss the dialogue part of it that way. So, and if we find out that if there are questions and it's not loud enough, then we can have a handheld microphone too. So thank you for coming on this. Let's bow in prayer and we'll go ahead and get started. Lord, we thank you for just the joy of being able to come and talk and learn, and we just invite you into our presence here as we study the history of our church and look to the understanding who we are and where we've come from. We pray that you will give us a clarity of mind and an openness of heart. Just lead us on, O Lord, we pray through your Son. Amen. So let me just give you a little bit of background of where this is coming from. This started from a conversation Joni and Carol and I had when we were talking about the new member class, because part of the new member class is devoted to understanding grace and some of the Wesleyan theology and all of that. And we realized how difficult it is to talk in depth about any of that in one membership class. And so we started talking about expanding it, and we had the suggestion, I can't remember who made it, it was probably Carol's suggestion, but I don't know if it was Carol or Joni or myself, but we had the suggestion of turning it into a class that we would open up to everyone. And we realized that there is an interest in these, at least I hope there's an interest in it, because of all that's going on in the denomination, and we want to learn more about it. One of the good things, and there's very few good things that have come from all of this talk, but one of the good things that have come from this is I think we are seeking to understand who we are as Methodists more than we have before. And we realize that most people come to the church not because we're Methodists or Baptist or Episcopalian, it's because of the congregation. You know, it's because we fall in love with the people that we are in relationship with, but there's still an underlying belief and a history of who we are and what we're about. So the way we're going to organize this is tonight or this afternoon, we're going to be talking about church history, which I know is one of the most thrilling topics in the world. I get that. I love history, and yet I almost always fell asleep in my church history classes in seminary. So I'll try to make it interesting, but we'll talk today about where we came from as Methodists and an understanding of our history as Methodists. Next week we'll talk about the theology of United Methodism, or not United Methodism, but Methodism. And look at some of the theological principles about it. Then 2 weeks from today, on the 22nd, I believe, if I got that right, the 22nd, we'll take a look at the future and what does the future of Methodism look like. That's where I joked in church today that after these many years in ministry and 7 years as a DS, my crystal ball is extremely cloudy, so it's not going to be with clarity that I'll talk about what the future looks like, but I think there is enough indications that we can at least look at what some of the potential is and that kind of thing. Along the way, we'll open it up for question. I really want it to be dialogue. One of the challenges of having a larger group is it's harder to have dialogue, but I want this to be a class of dialogue and questions and all of that. If there are questions, because we are recording it, and we can make this available to people afterwards, we might have to pass you a microphone so that it's not so much, it's so helpful to hear here, but it's also mainly for online as well, for the recording of that. So that's where we're going, and hopefully along the way, if there are other questions that you have or whatnot, then we can go from there. So the first thing I wanted us to look at is just getting the Methodist movement placed in history, and if I could have some help. Glenn, if you could help on this side, and George, if you could pass that out. the Methodism, and we're talking more about the Methodist movement. It's not just United Methodism. United Methodism is fairly recent in history. We were started in 1968. And so church history, if you look at the scope of church history, we're just barely a blip on the radar. And I have 50 copies, so I have not counted how many people are here. So if we run out of copies, we might have to share some copies. But what this is showing, and if you Google church history or denomination history, you can see all kinds of different flow charts and family trees and all of that. This is just a basic family tree. This is not meant to go in great detail or depth, but it's just a very early or very simple one. If you look at the family tree on here, it starts out the early Christian church, and then it goes into Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church, if you remember, Jesus told Peter he was the rock, and on that rock he will build a church. That's the Roman Catholic Church. They count their church going back to Peter. That was the original one. And then in about 1000 A.D., the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church split. And then you can see around 1500, the dates aren't on here, but around 1500, the next big split came where the Lutherans and Anglicans and Reformed Church split at that point. So about every 500 years, there's been a reformation in the church. Part of what we are experiencing right now is that we are in the window of the Fourth Great Reformation. So if you look at about every 500 years, there's been a reformation of the church. And so we see that. If you trace down the center line of that, the Anglican Church, you can see that that's where Methodists are, that's where we're located on the tree. So, and we'll talk about this more. The Anglicans, out of the Anglican Church came the Congregational, the Baptist, the Episcopalian, and the Methodists. And then you look down under the Methodists, and you can see the Holiness Church, Salvation Army, Church of God. There's a lot of churches that come. This is just for your information. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time on this. This is just to show you that in terms of church history, we can see that Methodism is part of, but it's not. There's much more to it than just what we think. We are not the center of the universe. Is probably what I'm talking about here. So if you could pass this out then too. I hate to blow your image that we are not the center of the universe, but we are one strain of Christianity, and we can see that. Now, what this is that I'm having him pass out is just an outline of where we're going and what we're talking about today. We can see that we are related to other churches in the family tree there, through clear back to the Catholic Church, but it broke away when the Anglicans, and then we broke away from the Anglicans that way. Now, where we're at in this, the Methodist revival. The founder of Methodism is John Wesley. John and Charles Wesley, back in the 1700s, John and Charles Wesley, who was born to, and I can geek out on this, so if I see your eyes glaze over, I'll try to move on. But John and Charles Wesley were the sons of Susanna and Samuel Wesley. Samuel Wesley was an Anglican priest. He was in one parish for 30-some years. He was looking to have his son, John or Charles, take over for him at his church in England. John and Charles went to Oxford University in England. They were highly intellectual, very intelligent. They were studying to become Anglican priests. While they were at Oxford, they formed what is called the Holy Club. And the Holy Club is this small group of students who met together every week. They met together and had conversation. They talked to each other. Out of that came their commitment to have communion often. They would serve other people. They would visit people in the prisons and in the hospitals, all the different things. They had certain things that were expected of the Holy Club. The Holy Club was seen as a radical group at that time because they were taking their Christian faith so much deeper than any other group at that time had done up until that time. How many of you have been, and this is just, how many of you have been on Emmaus Walk? You know, our version of, remember the share groups and the questions on the cards, the reunion cards on that, where have you experienced God, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of what they did with their Holy Club. One of the first questions they would ask every week is, how is it with your soul? You know, and they would reflect on it, and they would, it was a spiritual-based conversation. How is it with your soul? It was meant for the renewal and the refreshment and the sustaining of them. It was never meant to be a new denomination. They were trying to do this as students to be able to bring revival to their own hearts and to the institution of the church. In 1735, they were both invited to Georgia, to the state of Georgia, or the colony of Georgia, to be ministers to the colonists and missionaries to the Native Americans at that time. They were Anglican priests at the time, but they both said, especially John Wesley, who founded, and we'll see, had admitted that he had never really been converted at that time. He went into the Anglican priesthood without ever having a conversion experience. He went in as it was an educational, it was a commitment for a career, that kind of thing, but he had never had that. On May 24th in 1738, he went to a revival meeting called Aldersgate. It was on Aldersgate Street. And why they were there, part of this was, this sounds horribly boring, but for him it was transformative. There was a reading, and I can't remember who the commentary was. It was a commentary on the book of Romans. And why that commentary on the book of Romans was being read, John Wesley wrote later that he felt his heart strangely warmed. And that was where he had his conversion experience. He came in touch with grace and the understanding of grace and all of that. And so what came to that, their work in Georgia came to be a dismal failure. I mean, it was bad. And John Wesley got into a relationship with, and ended up marrying. The marriage didn't work. He went back to England and basically crashed and burned at that time. But it was all working for the Anglican Church. They weren't planting Methodist churches. They were working as missionaries for the Anglican Church. They went back to England. He had his Aldersgate experience, and then he went on. John Wesley and George Whitefield then began to work together. George Whitefield was another young man. They met at Oxford, a different tradition, but they began to do it. George Whitefield was very instrumental in the Calvinists or the Presbyterians, where it was more into predestination and some of that kind of, which we'll talk about more with theology. But they began to work together and had a series of meetings, and they began to preach. They saw that the Anglican Church had become so removed from real life that they began to preach out in the fields and going to the factories. And when the workers got off from their jobs, they would preach out in the fields to the factory workers because the factory workers were not connecting to the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church was being seen as exclusive. It was for the higher class. It was the upper middle class, upper class. They were not reaching the lower middle class, lower class. And so Wesley and Whitefield began to see a need for the Anglican denomination to be able to reach these lower class people and those who were working poor. And so this was scandalous at the time. The Anglicans, Episcopalians couldn't see. This was just a scandal to go out and stand on a stump and preach to people. I mean, that just wasn't proper decorum at the time. You know, but that's where they began to get their following. And so they organized the people that began to follow them into these small holy clubs or class meetings. They came to be known as class meetings. And it was a network of small groups doing what they were doing in Oxford with the holy clubs for being able to support one another, encourage one another, pray for one another, all of those kind of things. And what happened is so many people began to respond that it created this movement. You know, in England it started, and it was a wave throughout England, and then it spread to America in the 1700s. And when it went to America, I don't know if you've heard the term the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. There are three Great Awakenings, and most of them were from the Methodist movement, because that is who really brought Christianity and the church to the colonies. You know, when the Wesleys made their second trip to the colonies, they were in a much better place. They had been converted. They had experienced the grace that they were talking about. And they came over to America to be able to bring the message of Christ to that. And the churches at that time were being found or being formed so quickly, they couldn't get enough ordained clergy to man the churches. You know, that's where the Christianity swept through the colonies, and as the United States moved west, the church went west as well. And in that time, and this was the next great scandal of John Wesley, is he actually began to appoint lay preachers and lay leaders because they just couldn't get enough ordained clergy to staff the churches, to lead the churches. And so he got sideways with the Anglican leaders. The United States at the time, what was going on in the 1700s between the United States and England? Yeah, just a little bit of a revolution at the time. There was a disconnect between England and the United States. And so all of that played into it, to where the United States Methodists at that time were wanting to break away from what was going on in England and form their own church. And so that started that movement around that time. In that time, the Methodist churches were formed in what was called circuits. And the circuits, some of you have heard the term circuit riders. I assume many of you have heard the term circuit riders. What that was is their effort to try to bring order to the churches as they were being planted. And typically they would plant these churches wherever there was a settlement. So as these new communities were settled, a new Methodist congregation, but it was still not seen as a denomination yet. It was not. It was still the Methodist movement. It was a people called Methodists, and it was sweeping through that way. But the circuit riders would be where an elder or an ordained pastor would be assigned to a circuit, and then that elder or ordained pastor would have a team of lay leaders or lay preachers who would preach in the circuit. And so the elder would go around the circuit and would cover the sacramental needs, and would have communion and baptism, and that's the two main sacraments, but they would constantly be writing between the churches. Sometimes they would have 30 congregations on a circuit. And so the elder would only be seen, and there was no high-speed highways or anything like that. It would only be seen for like once every couple months. And the lay preachers would be that way. Would be ones covering the week-to-week thing. The circuit riders had a very short-lived life. Most of them averaged, the age was only high 20s, low 30s, because they were out on the frontier. You know, they were out riding through the wilderness to get to these churches and to be able to do it. And a high rate of burnout is true, but even more, a high rate of death. They just literally worked themselves to death, and they died very young. Now, the average age at that time was very young as well. So, but the circuit riders had a rough job. In the midst of that, then, what we saw happening is the Wesley was very reluctant to pull the trigger, bad imagery, to push the button, to form a denomination. He saw himself as a leader who was trying to bring revitalization to the Anglican Church. He really did not want to start a new denomination. He was trying to bring revitalization. When it came to America, the push became very strong to have it become an American church. And so at that time, it formed Methodism. You know, the term Methodism at first was very derogatory. You know, they were Methodists. They obsessed over method, you know, and there was all that. At some points early on, the Methodists were accused of being enthusiasts. I don't know when the last time we were accused of being enthusiasts, but Methodists were seen in very derogatory terms because of that whole thing. And so eventually it led to the formation of the Methodist Church. Out of that Methodism, that's our roots, you know, but we aren't the only ones that came from the Methodist movement. The British Methodists are different from the United Methodists. There are Methodists around the world. Most countries have Methodists. South America, Central America, Europe, Africa, Australia. There's Methodists all over the world. There's United Methodists in many parts of the world, but not as many places. And we'll get into that in depth. Now, what happened in the 1800s, the Methodism experienced a rapid growth in the U.S. as well as England. The Methodists were early on, were the ones who really were the first ones to really give a voice to women preachers and women leaders. And as early as the early 1800s, so we can thank them for Carol. So the early 1800s, the Methodists were the ones who first recognized that God could call women as well as men. That was not widely accepted at that time, but it was there in our heritage, and we were one of the first ones to really see that. And the Methodism was experiencing rapid growth in that time. In 1838 to 1902, you can see the Wesleyan Education Committee was formed, and their goal was the beginning of Sunday schools. You know, what we have known as Sunday school didn't start until that time, between the mid-1800s up until the early 1900s was when this committee was active. And not only did they start Sunday school, but they were very instrumental in starting in schools because the education system was not strong at that point, and they saw illiteracy and all of that as a real problem in the United States and in England. And so education was one of the early things of the Methodist Church. In 1784, and this is where Wesley got really sideways and ended up getting kicked out of the Anglican Church, is he began to ordain ministers in 1784, and that's what led to the breaking away of the Church of England. Now, if you read through John Wesley, I mean, Wesley was a brilliant man. He was well-read, well-written. He did all of that stuff. My imagination, obviously I never met him, although sometimes I feel like I'm old enough to have met him, but I never met him. But my imagination is Wesley was not one of these warm, fuzzy kind of pastors. You know, I see Wesley as being much like the prophets. You know, they were out on the edge. They were pushing the envelope all the time. And if you read Wesley's journals, it's replete with and I can't believe I just used the word replete. I mean, where'd that come from? But Wesley's journals have the entries where he would say, I preached at such and such a church on such and such a date. The service went well. I was asked never to come back again. The next week, I preached at such and such a church. And it was over and over again. He got kicked out of Anglican church after Anglican church after Anglican church. You know, he was not well accepted in the Anglican church. And yet he formed the organizational structure, was forming this Methodist movement that really just swept the United States and took Christianity throughout the United States. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What was he doing that they didn't like? I mean,
He was preaching in a way that it was impolite. You know, he was talking about the need to reach the poor, to reach those who the Anglican Church was not connecting with. He was calling a spade and identifying what the churches were missing. You know, a lot of those kind of things. If you read the sermons now, it's not all that offensive. If you can read all the Old English kind of language. But he would call a spade. He wasn't afraid to identify where the churches or where the structure.
they felt convicted by his
Well, convicted, accused. You say tomato, I say tomato. Yeah. And so that's when he left England and stopped focusing on trying to revive the Church of England and put all of his attention on the Methodist movement in the United States. And the First Great Awakening was 1730 to 1750, not 17,500. That meant to be a parenthesis there, not a zero. So it's from 1730 to 1750 was the First Great Awakening. That was the first wave of play, and you can see the churches along the East Coast, the colonies, that many of those churches, the old churches, were planted in 1730 to 1750. The Second Great Awakening was 1790 to 1840. It was during that time, and we have to picture this with the history of the United States as well. In this time, in the Second Great Awakening, Methodism grew from 58,000 members in 1790 to 1,661,000 members in 1860. And so that was the time of huge growth at that point. And it was at that time that Methodism began to attract the German immigrants. And so you have to look at U.S. history. There were waves of immigration that came through. The Irish came through, the Germans came in, all of those immigrants. And the Methodists were very effective in reaching these immigrant populations and connecting with them. And that's where a lot of the growth happened at that point. What was happening in U.S., any of you who are U.S. history buffs, what was happening in the mid-1800s in the U.S.? Civil War, or the build-up to the Civil War. You know, at that time, we were having our own debate about slavery and all of that. And in 1845, there was a first great split in Methodism. That's when, in 1845, and I apologize for the typing on this. I'm seeing all my typos in here. So Cindy did not type this. This is my own work, so blame me for it. In 1845, the churches in the slaveholding states left the Methodist Episcopal Church and they formed the Methodist Episcopal Church South. The sole issue was slavery. And so the southern states of Methodists, and this all happened at an annual conference. You know, we think our annual conferences are volatile. I can just imagine this one. At that annual conference, they began to debate that, and the northern churches brought a proposal to come out an abolitionist posture to speak out against slavery. The southern states and the southern churches were fighting against it. That led at that conference to split. The southern delegates actually got up, walked out of the meeting, went down the street to a church, and they formed their own church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South. That was the first split of the Methodists. Those branches then eventually in 1939 came back together and merged after the slavery issues all came in. Then in 1946, and then I'm going to open it up for a conversation. But in 1946, then, when all that, at World War II and all of that, the evangelical denomination merged with the United Brethren Church to form the Evangelical United Brethren, or the EUB Church. Both of these were German-speaking denominations. They appealed to the German immigrants. And in fact, the United Brethren, early in their history, were German-speaking churches. Both of them were German-speaking churches at about the time when they realized there was not as much need for German-speaking churches. They decided they would merge and come together. At that time, what was happening in the 40s then here? Germany, World War II. And so we had all the issues around that. And so but the evangelicals and the United Brethren merged together to form the EUB Church. It was very, very strong here in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, all through the Great Lakes, and for some reason out west in Oregon. It jumped over the rest of the country, but it was very, very strong right through this region. And so they formed. So we had the Methodist Church, which had been split to Methodist Episcopal, as well as all the different things that way, and the EUBs. In 1968, the EUBs and the Methodists they ended their conversations, and at the general conference of both denominations, they voted to merge in 1968. And that's what formed the United Methodist Church. Along the way, just so we don't think that we are terribly unique in this, the Methodist Church has split many times. The Nazarenes are part of were started out as Methodists. The Wesleyan Church started out as a part of the Methodist movement. Salvation Army started out as a part of. There's a lot of different denominations that are now actively in their own that were Methodists at one time. They're kind of our cousins in that. No bad people. It's just part of our history has been to divide. That's the reason I think. We and I've worked very hard against dividing churches and all that, but that's human nature. I mean, when I was driving around Northwest Ohio as a district superintendent, there's a number of communities I would drive into, and I would see First Baptist, Second Baptist, Third. There was one little town, I actually saw a Sixth Baptist church. And so it's human nature. Now, that Baptist is not so unique. I mean, we Methodists do the same thing. I just was on that. Because we tend to, instead of trying to work through our differences, we try to divide. We take our toys and go home. We want to do our own thing. That's part of the history of that. As you look at the merger of the EUBs and the Methodists in 1968, what we realized in hindsight is there were many EUBs who merged in name, but the marriage never really happened. That they were EUBs in name, or they were United Methodists in name, but they were still. My granddad was an EUB pastor. He got his first appointment when he was 18 years old as a United Brethren pastor, and then he went through the merger of the United Brethren and the Evangelical, and then from the EUBs to the United Methodists, and they talked openly how they felt like the Methodists swallowed up the EUBs, and they felt that they had lost their identity and all of that kind of stuff, and they weren't happy. But they went along with it. But there were many EUBs at that time who formed their own denomination. There is a denomination now called the Evangelical Church that is the EUBs that did not come into the merger. And so there's a lot of that kind of thing.
I was a teenager in 1968.
Mm-hmm.
I was raised in Evangelical United Brethren Church, actually over on Sylvania Avenue. It's now Hope United Methodist. But my whole family history was EUB. And this is what I recall, just bawling when I realized, oh no, now we're going to be United Methodists. And the reason I was so upset is the United Methodists didn't believe in, or they didn't stand for nothing. EUB, they have altar calls, they have revivals, they have, it was just because I grew up in a very spiritual environment, and I just remember being very bitter for years. And then finally, I had kids, but it was very traumatic.
Yeah, the EUBs and the Methodists was not an easy merger. And I know in Circleville, where our church was, we had three churches within 2 blocks. All of us United Methodists now, but they were all first at one time. There was First Brethren, First Evangelical, First Methodist. And so when the E's and the UBs merged, those two had to change their names. And so I can't remember the names now. Good Shepherd was one and Calvary was the other. They changed it to Good Shepherd and Calvary, Evangelical United Brethren. Then they merged with First Methodist, and so we had to change again. But you would never dream of having 3 churches within 2 blocks and even consider merging at that time. They were still separate congregations. And so there was a lot of unhappiness at that time. It was at that time, in terms of numbers, when the merger happened in 1968, that there were roughly 12 million members in the United Methodist Church in the United States, and about 2 million members outside of the United States. predominantly in Africa. That's where United Methodist in Africa is huge. I mean, has been the fastest growing. From 1968 to today, those numbers have switched. We still have roughly 14 million Methodists in the world. We're down around 6 million in the United States, and the rest are in the world, around 7 to 8 million in the world, predominantly in Africa. But we have United Methodists in Europe. There's one United Methodist conference, get this, that their conference covers the Ukraine and Russia. Can you imagine being the bishop of the Conference of Ukraine and Russia conference? And so we have Methodists around the world that way. The world is becoming more predominant. It really is a world denomination that way. Yeah.
I know we talk a lot about our faction in Africa. Hold on.
Just so we can hear on the recording.
I know we talk about our faction in Africa, but I'm having trouble picturing that. Is it in cities? Is it in villages? How is it over there in Africa? What does our denomination look like over there?
It's wherever there are people. There are some churches meeting under trees because they can't build buildings fast enough.
Okay.
When I went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo several years ago, I was in the city of Kamina, which is about 300,000. Do you remember Lorraine that was here last Thanksgiving a year ago? That's where I first met Lorraine. It's in Kamina, which is in southern DRC. And there was a town of about 300,000 people, 96% unemployment, huge amount of poverty. And so it's cities, but it's not like our cities. The church, they have congregations. When we were there was a church that was growing, and they were building the church as they could raise the money. When we were there, they had the footprint of the building about three or four blocks high around the whole footprint, and they just kept adding blocks as they raised the money for the blocks. When I talked to somebody just a short time ago, they now have it up almost head high, but they're still building, and the problem is they're outgrowing it already. They are very active in hospitals, the medical world over there. They have maternity wards, they have hospitals, they have schools. You walk around over there and you see the Cross and Flame a lot because it is meaningful. It means a lot for them over there. So it's not any one. The trouble we in the United States have when we talk about the church in Africa and the Congo is we look at this block of people and we try to think that this huge block of people can be described as one group.
Right.
It's like, how would you describe the church in the United States? Is it country? Is it city? Is it poor? Is it rich? Yes. It's all of that. And it's the same thing there because there's millions of people. And there's a great difference between South Africa and the Congo and Zaire and
So did it exist in Africa before here?
Pardon?
Did it exist in Africa before the
No,
America?
the missionaries went from Western Europe over into Africa and took the church there. And it's not just Methodism, but United Methodists are one of the leading missionary movements that has brought the gospel to the continent of Africa.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Are there other questions so far? I don't want to race through to trample over everybody.
Whatever happened to Charles Wesley? He seemed to...
Charles Wesley took a backseat to John. He wrote a huge number of hymns. If you look in our hymnal, you'll see a lot of Charles Wesley hymns. And there are he was not as much in the lead of Methodism as John, but he was certainly in a supportive role.
Now, they both came to Georgia. Did they both go back at the same time?
Yeah, very close. John went back with his tail between his legs because his marriage broke up and was a failure and all of that kind of stuff. But they worked together on a lot of that. Yeah. And they both attributed, Susanna, their mother, was never served a church, but she really formed the faith of her children. And so they point to Susanna Wesley as really the foundation of their church, of their faith that way. Yeah, other questions? I want to make sure I'm... So at that point then, what we're seeing is, in terms of history, from 1968 to today, what has happened is the United States, the decline that we've been talking about started basically at the time we merged. You know, that was the high point of Methodism. And from that day on, the decline started, and it was more by attrition than anything, and for whatever reason, cleaning up membership rolls, whatever. But the decline started, but the world started gradually doing it. Where we are at now is the world is soon going to become the leading voice in Methodism, in United Methodism, but the bulk of the money comes from the United States, because many parts of the world, they have the people, they don't have the resources. And so it's the resources from the United States that's supporting the ministries in the rest of the world, like Africa University, a lot of the hospitals, like the Lorraine's farming ministry is supported by a lot of donations from the United States. There's a lot of missionary work being done in these other parts of the world. But the people are there, and so that's where there's a lot of. It's hard trying to operate a worldwide denomination. It's hard enough to operate a citywide church. It's even harder to do a worldwide denomination that way. And there's a lot of differences in culture, differences in traditions, language, all of that kind. When we have a general conference. Our general conference, they have to pay for, I forget how many languages it's translated in, because the people bring their different languages. And English is not the predominant language of the people in the Democratic Republic of Congo or some of the other countries there. And so when, let me speak to that too, just our organization a little bit. As Wesley was forming the church, it was about the same time as the U.S. was forming our form of government. You know how our form of government has the judiciary, the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch, the three branches. United Methodists are formed exactly the same way. You know, in the U.S., it's Congress is the legislative, judicial is the Supreme Court, and the executive is the president. In the United Methodist Church, it's the executive are the bishops, the judicial is our judicial council, which is the church Supreme Court, and then the legislative is the general conference and the annual conferences. So we have the same three branches of government. And so whenever we hear people talking about how the bishops are not enforcing, part of it is they have a limited job description of what they're able to do. You know, it's just like our president can't do everything. Because it's divided among the three branches. It's the same thing in our denomination. Is we are divided among three branches. Each branch has its own job description, its own duties that way. And so there's a lot of parallels. I'm not saying that's a good parallel, but it's the reality of where we are. That's part of the struggle and part of what's going on that way. Yeah.
Has there ever been talk of the United States Methodist splitting off from the rest of the other countries?
There's been talk, but it's not been, because we know that if we split off, then those ministries are going to dry up because of the financial resource, and that's where the growth, there is apostolic growth in these other places. People are being reached for Christ. You know, there are people that their lives are being transformed, and schools and all of that. And so we see that our money is supporting the work of the church. You know, and that's part of the challenge that we have is in the United States, we go through these waves where we think that we have to take care of our own first. You know, we have this drive to say, you know, it's us first, and then if there's anything left over. Well, to me, that's not the way the gospel reads. you know, it is, we are called to be able to give to proclaim the good news to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the world. It's here at home, our region, our nation, or whatever, and the world. And so we have a responsibility to be worldwide as well as local. And so they're just like we have gone through waves in U.S. history of where isolationism is a big thing. The church has the same thing, where we want to isolate ourselves from everybody else and not worry about everybody else. And yet we still get confronted by the gospel about, can we really do that and remain faithful? Yeah.
But isn't our apportionment dollars, aren't the apportionment dollars that our offerings, contribute to, it goes to UMCOR. I mean, when we're talking about reaching the world, whenever, Puerto Rico devastation, my first reaction is, oh, thank God, we've got UMCOR there. Those people are in right at the beginning of the crisis.
Yeah, there are many times, like our apportionment, for those who don't know, every year we are apportioned a certain amount of money that goes to both the district annual conference, general conference, and the world. That money is apportioned to us on how much money we spend on ourselves and how many members we carry on the roll. There's this long formula that I don't get. I mean, I'm not a mathematician. I can show you the formula. Those of you who are math people, I would love to show it to you. You can figure it out. But we are apportioned a certain amount. Within that is money for, like UMCOR, and our apportionment dollars pay for the administrative part of UMCOR, so that whenever we have a special offering for UMCOR, all of that money that is given in the special offering goes to the disaster that we're designating it for. There's also money that goes to Africa University. There is money that goes to that. There's also money that goes to the annual conference to support the bishop's salary, the conference programming, that kind of stuff, grants and all of that. So it's funding along the way. When I was a district superintendent, I was very thankful for the churches that paid their apportionments because my salary came from those apportionment dollars. So there is that tie-in as well. Other questions? So in the midst of that, as I was saying, in '68 we were at a high point in the United States in terms of attendance. Since that time, we have been declining. When the pandemic hit, like a lot of churches, it's not that the decline started with the pandemic, it's that we hit a cliff and we fell off the cliff. I mean, that's just the reality of the numbers that way. And we're seeing that across the path. This argument that we are currently enjoying, tongue-in-cheek on that, started in 1972. In 1968, when the merger happened, there was nothing said about human sexuality in the discipline. In 1972, at the very end of the General Conference, there was a proposal made. I think it was one of the last actions of that General Conference in 1972, that a proposal was made where the language would be put in that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. That was the beginning, and ever since that time, that argument has been waged from 1972 all the way up to today. It has been a common, every time we have a General Conference. In our polity, the way we structure, we have a General Conference every 4 years unless there's a pandemic. So every 4 years, it follows the politics. Whenever there's a presidential election, there's been a General Conference. I think I would love to have seen those two separated, because whenever there's a presidential election, we're a highly politicized culture, and that carries over into the General Conference work. And I would love to have seen that separated, but it's never been done. People just didn't ask me my opinion on that. So, And so it has been debated over the years. There have been additions made to where the discipline is stronger. There's been other, every 4 years we have that legislative action to where proposals are made and can be voted in or voted down. Just imagine what would happen if you try to run a legislative meeting with 1,000 people from around the world and trying to run a legislative meeting. Those who are frustrated with committee meetings here in the church, those are a piece of cake compared to what this is being talked about. And so it's a highly politicized time in that, and it's led to that. There have been churches that have left over the years and all of that. What has prompted this is that as we have gone through this time, there has been talk about the Global Methodists had been, it's really a formation of 3 or 4 different groups. There's the Wesley Covenant Association, the Good News Movement, a couple of the evangelical groups have been starting to talk about that and wanting to, for example, when I was ordained, I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine who was a part of the Good News Movement at that time, whose dad was a part of the Good News Movement, and they were talking at that time about looking forward to the day that they would split off and form their own denomination. It's been talked about for 30-some years. I don't think the human sexuality it's certainly not the only issue that's causing this. It is the lightning rod issue that has prompted a lot of the angst and the pain, but there are many other issues that are going into it, and a lot of the people that are pushing this, that have pushed the breakaway, are ones that have not been happy with the role of the bishops. They've not been happy with the Methodist structure, the itineracy. And you go down the list. There's a whole list of things that they've been unhappy about. And so it is kind of the convergence of all of that. And they saw this is the opportunity that has been taken to push that. This is not the first time that our denomination is split. I'm afraid it won't be the last time our denomination splits. And it's not really a split. It's right now in Maumee Watershed District, there have been 4 churches, and I'm looking at Michelle, 4 churches that have disaffiliated out of 120? 95. I'm thinking of my 100 and some churches down in Northwest Plains when I was there. So 4 out of 95 churches have voted to disaffiliate in our own district. Across the conference, we have between 900 and 1,080 churches have disaffiliated. Will there be more? Probably, but right now it's 80 churches have disaffiliated. So that's about 8%, give or take. So it's not as big of a movement as what people had thought at first. There is, and a good number of those 80 churches are not aligning with the Global Methodists. They're leaving, taking the opportunity to leave to become independent, which I have issues with that myself, because I think it's dangerous to be independent because there's no oversight and I mean there's a whole other thing. But that's more than you asked for from me today. Yeah.
How does, I assume that the disaffiliation is a process.
Mm-hmm.
How does that?
I don't know why you couldn't. I could hear him right here.
I assume that the disaffiliation is a process.
Oh, everything in
What-
Methodist is a process.
What prompts the beginning of a disaffiliation?
The leaders of the church have to, to answer your question, yes, there is a process. There has to be a church conference called, and there's a process of discernment. The church has to go through some discernment about that, and then there's a church conference called. And then if the church has received 2/3 majority, it has to be 2/3 of the church have to vote for disaffiliation. And then it goes to the annual conference. There's more steps in the midst of that. Along the way, there has to be, there's some financial things like the pension liability, the unfunded pension liability has to be paid, because if church is pulled out, then the pastors that have served that church who are still alive would be retired. All of a sudden their pensions would be would be in danger. So there is an unfunded pension liability, there's some if there's grants that have been approved, a couple years of apportionments, those agreements have all been put in place that way. And then they can, but the big thing is
So
the
it sounds like a
two-thirds.
field day for lawyers.
It is. And the danger that I've seen is that if a church comes to that point of voting and they don't get 2/3, then that church is split. And so unless you are absolutely sure that you're going to get 2/3, it doesn't make sense to bring it to a vote to divide the church. What I've been telling people here is it's hard enough to hold a church together in this society. You know, in this day of division and polarization, all that, it's tough holding a church together. And so why, if we're not confident in doing that, why would we want to? And Maumee Church, from my experience and what I'm seeing, is we have people of different opinions, but we are enjoying being in relationship, and it's okay having different opinions. You know, what the Global Methodists are doing is, it's the United Methodist has historically been a big tent. What is being talked about as being a small tent. Our social principles are not binding, and so whenever a denomination makes a statement on certain social issues, whatever it may be, those are not binding. The only thing binding is the Book of Discipline. In the Global Methodist, my understanding is in the Global Methodist, whenever there are statements made, it is binding, and the churches and pastors and everybody has to be a part. So whether it's abortion or gun control or whatever. And so it's big tent, small tent kind of thing. My feeling here at Maumee is that this church has a history of being a big tent where we may differ from each other, but we still love each other. Or at least like each other. You know, it doesn't mean we always get along, but there's still the relationship that is valued there. And so our decision as a leadership and our leadership team, I've been talking about this with our leaders and with a number of the committees. I've gone out to small groups, and my conversations with any of the groups I've had have come to the point of saying that as long as we are not going to be made to do what we cannot, what is against our beliefs, we don't want to bring ourselves to this point of dividing the congregation. And I have facilitated, I have presided at some of the church conferences where churches have disaffiliated. And after those meetings, several times I've done that, I've had conversations with people who are in tears because their church voted in a different way than where they believe. They've lost their church. And they don't know what they're going to do. One person coming out, I was down in Salina at a church conference for this, and one person had been a member of that church their entire lives, and all of a sudden the church voted to go with the Global Methodists, and they couldn't abide. That's not where they were at, and because of the binding issues and all of that, they said it's not just that the church voted to disaffiliate; it's that it was so toxic that, and they had grandchildren who were gay. Who are gay, and because of the toxicity of the conversation, people were attacking the grandkids because of their being gay. You know, and they said, because of this process, we have lost our church, and we don't know what to do now. You know, so that's the byproduct that too often we don't see when we're looking. I would argue that if you're looking for a pure church, you are never going to find that. You know, we to me, what we're looking for is a faithful church that is pursuing being what God has called us to be.
Preach it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where I'm coming from. And this is not about me. This is the church, but my reading, and those of you who have been in those conversations, you can, hopefully if you disagree, we can talk about it one-on-one rather than in a public place, but that's the reading I have of where we're at right now. Yeah.
So those churches that decided to disaffiliate still consider themselves Methodist?
No, if they are aligning themselves, the first step is to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church.
Okay.
Then they have to decide if they want to become Global Methodist or align with a different, they would not be United Methodist anymore. Once that vote is taken and once they pay the pension liability and complete all the requirements, they are no longer United Methodists.
Okay, because you kept using the term Global Methodist, and that's why I
The Global
wondered.
Methodist is the new denomination that's being formed.
Okay,
It's the more conservative branch that's forming a new denomination. Now, that's what I was saying before. The United Methodist is not the only Methodist church in the world. I mean, we have Free Methodists, we have Wesleyan, we have a lot of cousins. You know, Nazarenes are a cousin of ours. You know, there's a lot of different cousins in the church world that way. If you want to someplace up here, and I really don't know where, I had too many papers around here. Someplace I have a whole chart that showed all of the Christian denominations, and it was such a spider web of lines, I didn't want to pass that out. But I can show it to you. But United Methodist is the largest of those, but it's not the only. The British Methodists are different than the United Methodists.
How would we, as
Just a minute, let's get a microphone here for you, Glenn.
how do we, as members of this particular congregation, how do we respond to those persons who would question us about the role of, let's say, sexuality? Because I believe that rumors abound about how, I mean, I've heard everything from the Methodist Church is going to disappear to the Methodist Church will swallow up every church in the neighborhood.
And there's a lot of false information out there. Our society, our political process has shown that our society specializes in false information and rumor and innuendo. One of the things that have angered and hurt me the most in this process is the number of times I've heard colleagues that I've trusted will say basically about me, but not just me, but where their statements saying the Methodist preachers aren't going to believe in the resurrection. The Methodist preachers aren't going to believe in salvation, all of that. And I will tell people openly, as long as I'm preaching, there's going to be Methodist preachers who are preaching the resurrection, the death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. I am an Orthodox, and there's room there. I believe with all my heart, or I couldn't do it. I believe with all my heart that there's room for the Orthodox church and Orthodox preachers in the Methodist church. Are there people that push the envelope one way or the other? Yes, there always has been. One of the dangers that I see is, and this is more than you asked for, but one of the dangers I see for the Global Methodists is when they break away, I give them 20, 30 years before they're going to have the same debate, because they're going to have the same influences. There's going to be children and grandchildren who come out, and they're still going to have the same issue. There is no pure church because we are made up of people. And we've got to learn how to reach out to people of all people. Do we compromise our faith and our values? No, but to me, I read that in Scripture, I read the greatest commandment is to love. Love God, love others. It doesn't say love if, it's love. Does that mean I have to love people who I disagree with? Yes. Does it mean I have to agree with everybody? No, but I still have to love. So there's a lot of, I think how we respond is by saying that we are still going to be a biblical church that is in the Orthodox faith, however language you want to use to it, where we still believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We still believe in the evangelical commitment and the need for us to respond to the grace of God. It's that kind of thing where I hate it when people are washing with such broad strokes and vilifying because they're trying to justify their own way of thinking. This is where the church has become weak, in that the church is allowing the world to influence us rather than us influencing the world. And we've got to be able to, at some point, we as Christians have got to be able to influence the world and say, what we're doing in our politics is just wrong. It's just wrong. We've got to be able to learn how to love and treat each other with respect, that kind of stuff. Obviously, I don't have a good, concise answer to your question.
Well, I mean, it's an answer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it allows you to form an answer or response to
And-
somebody who
Yeah.
raises questions.
And one of the things that I will tell people is I have heard nothing at all where it'll say churches will be forced to do something that they don't believe in. If they don't believe in same-gender weddings, there's no place where it's showing that they will be forced to do it, or preachers are not forced to do that. Where we can still be in that. It's it may be that at some point it will be where the churches will be allowed to, but there will be no place where it will be forced to. People ask me what's going to happen. Well, that's where I go to my answer. My crystal ball is pretty cloudy right now. I don't know what's going to happen beyond right now. But what I believe is right now, that's the best answer I can give. I believe when I became a United Methodist, when I went into ministry, I was born and raised in the church. I have told you all in church here that I'm one of those that grew up in the church where I can probably count on one hand the number of times we were not in church on a Sunday morning. And I was born into the EUB church. I was 6 years old when the merger happened. So I'm more United Methodist than I am EUB at that point. But when I was called into ministry, I searched and I looked which denomination, which church would I most like, which am I most similar to, that I feel that I can be the most in line with that way. And I found that the United Methodist Church, it voices where I'm at spiritually. I love the emphasis on grace. I love the whole idea of prevenient, justifying, sanctifying grace. I love the idea that we believe in the evangelical conversion as well as social action. I love the idea that we are a both-and church, not an either-or church. It's not either evangelical commitment to Jesus Christ or social action. It's a both-and. It's not either this or that. And I love the idea that there are still a core set of values that we have. Have we lost track of what some of those core values are? Yes. But does that mean that we should just scrap the church? No. I think that's time for us to get involved and to be able to re-engage and to learn more about what the church is about. I really think part of the reason we're having all of this identity crisis in the Methodist Church is because we have not done the work that we need to do ourselves to understand who we are. I mean, when was the last time we had a conversation around what does it mean to be a Methodist? I mean, when was the last time we talked about the theology of what it means to be a Methodist? I mean, we love the Maumee Church, and we get that. We know what it means to be a member of Maumee Church, at least partly, but we've gotten, and excuse me on this, but we've gotten a little lazy about it. And we've got to be able to re-engage what it means. This is our faith. I mean, this is where we need to engage even deeper to be able to be the church that God is calling us to be. And I will tell you right up front, if you are expecting a perfect church, I don't have one for you. And when I went into churches as a district superintendent and we had those conversations about the next pastor and I asked them what they want, I said, if you're asking me for a perfect pastor, you're going to wait for a long, long time because there is no perfect pastor. And I said, I can't bring a pastor to a perfect church. And if you think that you have found a perfect church, then don't walk into the door because it's going to be imperfect as soon as you walk through the doors.
You did not say that.
Am I wrong? I mean, there isn't, because the church is made up of people, we are imperfect.
Yes, amen.
You know, and so we do the best that we can with what we have. But I am really tired of seeing the church being influenced by the world when, according to Scripture, at least the way I read it, we should be doing the other way around. We should be influencing the world, not the world influencing us. We should be teaching the world what it means to love. We should be teaching the world what it means to be able to engage in a faithful way and to be able to follow Christ. We've not done a good job to show people and to tell people what it means to follow Christ. Again, I'm willing to hear that debate, but that's my observation. And I'm including myself on that. I mean, I'm a leader of the church, so if I'm blaming the church, guess who I'm blaming? Because it comes back to the leadership. I'm convicting myself in that as much as anybody. But that to me is, honestly, that's what keeps me awake at night more than anything, is what have we done to the church that God has gifted us? You know, and we have an opportunity to turn that around and do something dynamic here, and to be able to become countercultural in ways that we don't even know. You know, I'm excited about the future of Mommy Church. I'm excited about how we can carry on this history and be able to move forward. Is it going to be easy? No. Does it mean we're going to keep everybody that's been coming to church? No. We're going to lose people. But as I told our leadership team the other night, we're going to lose people if we do something. We're going to lose people if we don't do anything. I would much rather lose people because we're doing something than losing people because we're not doing anything. And so we've got to be able to get to that point. I'm bleeding all over you, so I don't need to do all that. But are there other questions? Yeah.
I have a statement. I wasn't. Hello, I'm Debbie, and I'm an alcoholic. I've been sober for 2 years and 9 months. I not only experienced the grace of God and a miracle, but I experienced grace by so many of these wonderful people in this church. Mm-hmm. And I belong to 2 other churches. Mm-hmm. I would not have gotten that there. Mm-hmm. And so I was welcomed back with open arms. So which sin is worse? And I do thank everybody for prayers and their love, and for Carol telling me every time she sees me I'm the miracle lady, because I did almost die. I almost ruined my whole life, and I thank God that I'm the one telling the story and you're not reading about it in the newspaper.
I will tell you that I'm unapologetic about being United Methodist. I am people will ask me if I'm embarrassed about what's going on. Well, I'm embarrassed the way we're treating each other. I'm grieving the way that we're treating each other on both sides, progressive and evangelical. I'm distraught over that. But I'm unapologetic about being United Methodist. This is where my spiritual home is. This is where I believe God has called me. This is where I am planning on living out my ministry, trying to be the best witness to whatever church I'm assigned to, appointed to. This is where people have invested in me and through this church. This is who I am. The theology that we'll talk about next week, that theology is where I have taken root. I mean, that whole idea of God's grace and that theology, I could not find another church where that's true in that. Now, I say that, but at the same time, am I frustrated by it? Oh my gosh, yes. I'm terribly frustrated by our church. The 7 years I was on cabinet, terribly. And you know that image of you have to be careful what you wish for, because somebody once told me that being on cabinet, you get to see the sausage made, and it really does not help the matter that much. And so I saw things that I never wanted to see. But it didn't make me stop loving the church. It made me want to be able to work harder to be able to help improve the church. And so I'm not willing to give up on it yet. That's just my own belief that way. And the history and the theology that just resonates with who I am and who I believe God has wired me to be.
Very fortunate to have you with us. Yes.
Well, thank you. So I would suggest that's a good stopping point for today. This isn't the end of the conversation. Next week we'll cover the theology and try to understand more about who we are theologically and how we think of God. There's still room for people. I'm really glad we moved it into the sanctuary. We would have been on laps in the chapel. and it is great having everybody here. If there are others that you think could benefit by listening, invite them to come. We'll do kind of the same format next week, but we'll be talking about theology. And then the 2 weeks, I'll take a stab at looking at where I think Methodism is going. To be honest, I have no clue what I'm going to say that time. Next week at theology, I have a pretty good handle on what that's going to be. The 2 weeks, but I don't have to know since that's 2 weeks away yet. Yeah.
Is the Book of Discipline online? Like if we Google search Methodist Book of Discipline, would we find it so we could see?
It is. I also have it. I'd be happy to loan to you. The discipline, the most current discipline is the 2016 Book of Discipline, because the 2020 General Conference was canceled. So it normally is every 4 years. And what we need to understand is the beginning of the Book of Discipline, the historic and theological pieces of the discipline are not changeable. So our theology, people ask, is our theology going to change? Well, the theological principles, by our own rules, are not going to be changed. What is changed are the rules and when I was a DS and I walked into a church and I saw somebody had a Book of Discipline, I said, oh no, here we go. Because it's you can find anything that you want to in the book, because it's a committee written book every 4 years of 1,000 people trying to legislate, and so there's inconsistencies in it. And I've joked with people, if you have insomnia, if you suffer from insomnia, the Book of Discipline is a great way to combat that, because it's filled with legalese. Now, I love if you ever want to read next week, I'll be quoting a lot of it, because the theological parts, the very first part of the discipline, is a great document to read, because it will give you the theological underpinnings of who we are. And next week I'll use that as the source of a lot of our conversation. Yeah.
I just looked it up and it's available through Cokesbury
Okay.
online.
If you might have to pay for it through Cokesbury, if you want a copy of it to read, come to me and I can loan you mine. Yeah.
You can view it online at cokesbury.com.
Can you? Okay. Because I've always had I'm old school enough. I would rather read a book hard copy myself. My kids will accuse me of being old all the time, and I am. Any other questions today for the history? I appreciate you coming out. I love the fact that we have this many people here. I love the fact, I don't know if you saw last Sunday in the Blade picked up this and put it in their church section on Sunday paper. I'm not sure how that happened.
There's styrofoam.
The Styrofoam collection did the same thing. We were inundated with Styrofoam today. And so the Blade is helping us get some free press out that way. So that's great. So if you are here from another church, you are welcome, and we love having you a part of the conversation as well. Could I close this in a word of prayer, and then I'll hang around if you have any questions. I'll even turn my microphone off so we don't hear everybody on that, but I'll have time for dialogue. Lord, I thank you for just the conversation. I thank you for how you have called us and you have loved us. I thank you, Lord, for the history and those who have gone before us and for how they've invested in our faith and in our church. And Lord, we confess that we are way imperfect and we have made a mess of so many things, but we know that it's not anything that is greater than you, and you can help us come through this and overcome this, and you can help us be focused on what our purpose, what your purpose for us is. So unite us as a church, O Lord. Unite us as a denomination. Help us to see that there is so much more that unites us than divides us, and allow us to bring glory to you. We pray this all through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you all very, very much.